All right, Chapter 19, Section 3, we're looking at World War I here on the home front. Now, winning the war wasn't the job of American soldiers all by themselves. Because World War I was such an immense conflict, the entire economy had to be refocused on the war effort. The shift from producing consumer goods to producing war supplies was too complicated and important of a job for private industry to handle on its own. So business and government collaborated in the effort, and in the process, the power of government is greatly increased. In this chapter, we're going to really look at how business and government cooperated during the war. We'll try to see how the government promoted the war, looking at the attacks on civil liberties, and then summarize the social changes that affected African Americans and women. As we look at Part A, Congress gives power to Wilson. That usually does happen during any break of war that the United States is involved in. But because this was such a ginormous job, and this was really going to be our first war, for the most part, fought completely over in Europe, the government created, Wilson and Congress are going to create what's called the War Industries Board. It becomes the main regulatory body of the economy during the war. And it's really pretty much organized under the leadership of a guy by the name of Bernard Baruch. Bernard Baruch was a very prosperous businessman and a very good friend of Franklin D. Roosevelt's. One of the most important parts of this, though, too, was really to help business shift from producing consumer goods to producing things now for the war. Certain private industries will fight back. They'll try to resist that, but the government's going to step in and pretty much get them to follow along with other industries to help with the war effort. And this was kind of Bernard Baruch's, you might say, gift. Well, how did the war affect U.S. economy? Well, wages in most industries are gonna rise. Hourly wages for most people will rise actually by 20% during this time. But unfortunately, a lot of that increase or that extra income is going to be kind of undercut by rising food prices and housing costs. Large corporations will see enormous profits, and so you're going to see companies getting kind of wealthy again. Even though wages are increasing, there's still a definite difference between management and labor. And as a result of that uneven pay between labor and management, you're going to see conditions increase or boom for unions. And so union membership will really increase, which meant that a big scare was going to be, are these guys going to strike to get a higher wage, which was a real scare during this time. And the government tried to work things out with labor unions and with labor to the point where Wilson will establish what's called the National War Labor Board in 1918. And under that board, workers that refuse to obey those decisions could actually lose their draft exemptions. And so they actually passed a war order called the Work or Fight order. And so if they weren't going to work, they were like instantly, you might say, or had the right to be instantly drafted into the war. So that was a way in which they tried to limit the number of strikes that were going on. And also, how did U.S. civilians respond to the war? Well, national labor, or not a national labor, but a national food administration will be set up under Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover single-handedly when Germany kind of ripped through Belgium at the start of the war, Belgium was in a serious state of starvation. Hoover kind of single-handedly does a fundraiser for them and delivers tons of food packages for the Belgian people, and really kind of saves the day there. Wilson's going to put him in charge of this food administration, and entirely voluntary, no rationing, no ration cards. He got everybody on board to kind of conserve food, use food for the war effort and things like that. So they help produce as well as conserve food in this time. It was extremely successful, and a lot of other administrations with regards to fuel, with regards to just about energy and all this stuff, are going to follow Hoover's idea about voluntary instead of rationing. Well, wars are very expensive, and so we look at Section B, selling the war. How did the government finance the war? Once the government had extended its control over the economy, it's faced with two major tasks: raising money and convincing the public to support it. And so that's what these 2 points are going to talk about. The government is going to raise about a third of this amount simply through taxes. He's going to pass a progressive income tax, which taxed high incomes at a higher rate, lower incomes at a lower rate. He'll also have a special war profits tax. He'll increase the excise tax on tobacco and liquor, as well as other luxury goods. And then raise the rest through kind of what's called public borrowing, or government or war bonds, those kind of IOUs. Right? They're sometimes referred to as Liberty loans and victory loans. Right? You can see some of the things on the right that kind of push that a little bit. To popularize the war, the government set up the nation's first, you might say, propaganda agency called the Committee on Public Information. The Committee on Public Information. Propaganda, as you should know, is a kind of biased communication designed to influence people's thoughts and actions. Placed in charge of the Committee on Public Information is a gentleman by the name of George Creel, and you see his picture there in the top right. George Creel's job was really to kind of, remember, this was a war where when Wilson declares war, most Americans were really not on board. This war was over in Europe. This didn't concern us. That was 3,000 miles away. But things got pretty drastic that he had to declare war, and he had to raise an army fast, and now he's got to figure out a way to get the people of America on board. And that's George Creel's job. He's got to sell America on the war, and he has to sell the world on Wilson's peace plan. And he kind of overshoots on both. But we also talked about this being an attack on civil liberties during this time period. And so we look at what groups were the main targets of anti-immigrant hysteria during the war. Early in 1917, Wilson really expresses his fear about the consequences of this war hysteria. And really the main targets of these attacks were Americans who had immigrated from other nations, especially those from Germany and Austria-Hungary. The most bitter attacks were directed against the nearly 2 million Americans who had been born in Germany. They were born in Germany. One of the reasons also that your book doesn't talk about, but it's kind of important to understand here, is that prior to World War I, the United States and Europe actually kind of worked on a transatlantic cable to be able to communicate quickly from one side of the Atlantic to the other. America obviously had the control of what was going out and coming in on the Western Hemisphere, but in Europe, that was England who had control of information going on in Europe coming over into the Americas. And so when you're talking about this world war here, most of the information is going to be censored by England, and so it's always going to be pro-England, very anti-German. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. How did The Espionage and Sedition Acts affect civil liberties in the United States. Now, already in June of 1917, Congress passed that Espionage Act, and then in May of 1918, the following year, they passed the Sedition Act, and so you get the Espionage and Sedition Acts of World War I. Under the Espionage and Sedition Acts, persons could be fined up to $10,000 and sentenced up to 20 years in jail. Doesn't mean they're always going to get that, but it would go up that high for interfering with the war effort or for saying anything disloyal, profane, or abusive about the government or the war effort. And so you look at those little posters on the side that George Creel creates. No war talk, obey the law, keep your mouth shut. Loose lips might sink ships. So put, kind of, again, propaganda created this little fear in people that I better not say anything. The passage would lead to over 2,000 prosecutions for loosely defined anti-war activities. Newspapers and magazines that opposed the war or criticized any of the Allies lost their mailing privileges. The Espionage and Sedition Acts targeted socialists and other labor leaders, such as Eugene Debs. He was a labor leader, and he was also a socialist. He was handed a 10-year prison sentence for speaking out against the war and the draft. Another big union boss, he led the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW. It was kind of a very militant and radical labor union. Also, the IWW insisted that their workers strike to try to break big business to pay them more. So the guy in charge there was Bill Hayward, or Big Bill. He's going to be accused of sabotaging the war effort, mostly because he urged his union men to strike for better conditions, and he's going to get a long prison term as a result of that. Social change. We talk about this Great Migration. It's important to understand that Black public opinion about the war was really kind of divided. On the one side, you had a guy by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois, who believed that Blacks should support the war effort. Du Bois believed that Blacks who supported the war would strengthen the calls for racial justice, and that's what he was all about. Remember, he started the NAACP, and he was very kind of militant, as well as Civil Rights Now. And he saw that our support, or Blacks supporting World War I, would kind of bring some healing between the whites and the Blacks in America at the time. But this is also a time where probably the greatest effect of the First World War I on America was really on Blacks, as they make this migration to the north. It's known as the Great Migration, a large-scale movement of hundreds of thousands of Southern Blacks to cities in the north, mostly to escape racial discrimination. But also there were problems in the South, as far as most of them were, farmers, and they weren't doing that well. And there were famines in the South during this time. You had the big boll weevil episode during this time, and made it more and more difficult for them to farm. As a result of the war, a lot of these industries were looking for labor. And as the military was still segregated, whites were, shipping off to war. Those jobs they had needed to be replaced, and so Blacks, were the likely source to fill those positions, and they will fill most of those positions and those jobs. Great job opportunities in those war industries in the North. But at the same time, it's important to understand too that racial prejudice against Blacks in America didn't go away just because they moved north. One historian that I listened to once said, anytime you rub two different cultures together, you're going to get friction. And that's kind of a good way to kind of understand how that happened during that time. That was kind of new for white Norths to kind of experience, and it just created some race riots in the North. And then we'll talk more about that as we get into World War II, and then we get to talk about the 1950s and civil rights movements that begin. The opportunities that the war offered to women, obviously, you had a lot of men that left. Not only will blacks fill a lot of those jobs, but women will move into those jobs that were once exclusively held by men. A lot of factory work and you name it, mines, copper mines and coal mines, women are going to kind of step in and do these jobs. I think the picture on the bottom right, excuse me, I think is a really good one because what you don't realize too is how dangerous some of these jobs actually were for women. But they'll also fill more traditional jobs such as nurses, clerks, and interestingly, this is a real transition, a real shift here, because most of the teacher positions in America were mostly men, and that begins to change right about here and through World War II, and more women become teachers. Many of them will become or offer their services as volunteers for their local Red Crosses, and this would go a long way in bolstering support for women's suffrage. Even President Wilson will acknowledge how important the service of women during the World War I crisis was. And in 1919, of course, Congress passes the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. And by 1920, that amendment is ratified by the states and becomes law. Continuing with social change, another big social change happens to be a really negative one, and one that I think right now we can kind of relate to a little bit. There was a worldwide flu epidemic after the war, which will affect about a fourth of the United States population, leading to about some 500,000 deaths. You can imagine how devastating it was to the economy, as you can watch the news right now, and maybe some of your parents right now are out of work as a result of this COVID-19. This happens here as well in the end of the 19-teens. What happened in the Army? Living conditions, trench warfare. It was horrible. Allowed those contagious illness to spread rapidly. And as the war ends and they all head home, it just floods through the world as, again, a pandemic. Historians, this becomes a rough one to kind of really nail down, but most historians really look at an additional, this is outside of the war deaths from World War I. This is flu deaths. It's an additional 20 to 30, as high as 30 million people who will actually die from this pandemic after the war. And so World War I has a major effect with regards to social change, because the loss of life was just like nothing else.